Is Olivia on? Olivia, if you could let people in on the chat, that'd be wonderful. Folks, if you could, like Jordy and Kate, Patrick are doing awesome. Great to see a lot of friends here. All right, it is 1:01, so we're going to jump in. We're trying to do this in 45 minutes. We'll see how we do. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today and really excited to have Michael Itzkowitz, someone I've learned a lot from, here with me today to help us go deep on ROI in higher education. Um, it's helpful, I think. I'm going to do a little bit of an intro and then turn it over to Michael, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So please drop questions in the chat as we're going. Um, I think it's a little bit helpful maybe to have my background coming into the work for those of you I don't know. I'm coming out of K-12, and I was the founder and CEO of Rocky Mountain Prep until about 3 years ago, which is a now large CMO in Colorado. And when we started Rocky Mountain Prep, our mission was to and through four-year college. And in 2015, when the KIPP Foundation started putting their KIPP through college data out about how their graduates across the country were succeeding and not in higher ed, it actually caused us to take four-year college out of our mission. And the reason why is because it just wasn't working well enough, often enough, for the majority of graduates that were similar to our Rocky Mountain Prep students. And it caused us to go back to first principles. Like, what do we actually want for our students is for them to realize opportunity in their lives, to have meaningful work in a thriving wage career. So that's what started to spark for me what's become a obsession and fascination with post-secondary success and what are the factors that are driving post-secondary success. So we know that post-secondary education matters. And in Colorado, where I've spent most of my career, 76% of top jobs will require some amount of post-secondary education. And at Willow, we also ask our students, why is making a good next step important to you? And the vast majority of our students tell us, I think something that won't be shocking to any of you, is that they're looking for economic security and they're looking for a good job. And that's what we hear time and time again is the most common explanation. Sorry, I'm still letting some people in here. Good to see everyone. Drop in the chat where you're coming from. And we know that pathways to a meaningful work and a livable wage are broken in our country, especially for students who are the furthest away from opportunity traditionally. And you can think about this using a lot of different data points that are quite depressing. For me in Denver, what this looked like is in Denver public schools, the majority of students who graduate DPS and then go on to higher education are first in their families to go to college. So I don't think that'll surprise many of us here. The majority of those students who are first in their families to go to college go to an institution called Metro State University. And Metro has a really great reputation in town. A lot of great people work there. They work hard to make it a positive experience. But the fact of the matter is that Metro, for a first-gen student, has a 9% on-time graduation rate. And over three-quarters will drop out at some point. And I'm sitting there as a K-12 systems leader, starting to understand that data and basically saying, like, what the heck are we doing? And why are we letting students, especially students who are first in their families to go to college, take out debt to go to Metro? And so that's really started a fascination for me. And I don't pick on Metro for the sake of picking on Metro. It's an example. All of our cities has a Metro State where students are just not succeeding enough in post-secondary, especially the students who are furthest from opportunity. So what we've started doing at Willow is building a student success platform that is trying to connect students more directly to economic and social mobility. The way we're doing that is we're lucky to partner with some of the strongest school networks, districts, and nonprofits to help with three core challenges. The first is we help students and the people that care about them, their families and their educators, navigate to and understand what are actually quality post-secondary next steps for me and that are a good fit for me. And we do that by projecting a return on investment, which Michael's going to talk a lot more about. And we do that across college, higher education programs, and also professional programs. Secondly, is we're helping students make a good plan to make high school meaningful. And we're kind of backwards planning the high school experience. And we're doing that from a fun and engaging career exploration platform that we've built. And so we're really supporting schools and the students in the schools and the people around those students with trying to both make high school effective and meaningful for them, and then have a good sense of what they might do next. Quickly, what that looks like. Sorry, my screen zoomed out a little bit. Oops. I don't know if that's coming through. There we go. What that looks like is that students can,
How we doing? Yeah.
if you could go on mute.
Yeah, this is a webinar. I'm attending right now.
We can hear you.
But yeah.
I don't know who that is.
It looked fun yesterday.
Okay.
You could select mute all if you want to mute everyone.
Thank you. There we go. I think we got it. Appreciate it. So first, we help students by projecting personalized ROI. And we do that on a 10-year basis. Frankly, we're not convinced that's the right view, but that's what we've chosen for now, across both professional and college programs. And then secondly, we've built a career navigation platform for Gen Z by curating quality short form social media videos from TikTok and YouTube Shorts, tagging them to ONET codes, and then based on what a student's profile and psychometric assessment says, delivering them good jobs that might be a good fit for them. No surprise, the students so far are enjoying that. And so with that, I'm excited to have Michael, someone I've learned a lot from, and thinking about how do we take ROI best practice and research and then translate that into something that's meaningful for students and educators. And Michael is going to go a lot deeper with us today. Many of you know Michael, but if you don't, he was the presidential appointee in the Obama administration to the Department of Education. And he oversaw as the director of the College Scorecard Project, the launch of the College Scorecard, which was the largest release ever of higher education data by the federal government. Since then, he's been a policy wonk at Third Way and Public Agenda think tanks, and now has started and is leading the HEA group, doing ROI research and consulting around the country. And his work has been cited in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, NPR, and many more. So with that, Michael, thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to dig in.
Thank you so much, James, and congratulations to everyone for making it to Thursday. We are very happy to have you all here. We hope everyone is doing well, and we hope this presentation is worth your time today. So I will try to run through a number of slides quickly to talk about how, one approach, I would say, to how I've looked at assessing ROI and economic mobility in higher education. As mentioned, I was overseeing the College Scorecard Project at the U.S. Department of Education, but over the past number of years now, as I get older, I've had the opportunity to really dig into the data and understand it and look at trends. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is just what can we learn from the data? And I hope that it helps you all think about this in different ways to understand what's out there, but in a number of ways that we can think about assessing whether institutions are actually providing a return on a very large educational investment that we continue to make today. 5,989 college programs, 353,326 college graduates. Now, you're probably wondering, what are those numbers? Maybe you've gone to the right-hand side of the chart already. But these are numbers that represent the amount of college programs within the United States and the amount of graduates at those college programs that actually were earning less than the typical high school graduate within a few years after they've completed their program. These are just some of the numbers that I started to see, which actually made me think about how can we ensure better outcomes for all students at all institutions across all college programs. And those are the things that I've been looking at over the past few years. Now, why even bother doing this? Isn't college just a great experience where we go hang out on the quad and eat Hare Krishna lunch with our buddies? I don't know what you all were doing if you were studying sociology at the University of Florida like me, but what we've seen over the past number of years through the UCLA incoming freshman study is that whatever we think and all the benefits that we know that comes with college, and there are plenty, the number one reason why students are attending is to get a good job and have a financially secure future. That's not the only reason, but year after year, that's what we've seen. Why are students pursuing higher education? Good job, financially secure future. So those are the facts. But what's the number one reason why they don't attend college? We see that it's becoming increasingly more important with the amount of jobs that will require some sort of post-secondary training. But what's the number one reason why they're staying out altogether? And we've heard about the declining confidence over the past few years. The number one reason causing them to think twice is cost. It's affordability. It is one of the largest educational or investments beyond a mortgage that anyone will ever make. But cost is the number one reason why it's keeping them out. So therefore, I started to think about ROI. It's combining these two things together. It's looking at value, economic value. Are you earning more than you would have if you never attended college? Relative to the cost, is it worth it? Are you earning your money back over time? Now, this has become a really hot topic over the past 5 or 10 years. I would say we used to be strictly focused on access and completion. And you need that. We need students to go to college and we need them to complete college. But we started to shift in terms of, are students getting something after they complete a program? And we've seen that the cost of college over the past few decades has steadily increased, right? We've seen it kind of flatten off. We've seen that recently through some new studies that have come out. But, when you talk to your parents, I'm sure they told you, as mine did, that college semester used to cost $50 a credit at CUNY. That's where they went. And I said, that's great, Mom, but it doesn't cost that much anymore. It's actually a lot more money. So that's why it's this topic of, are we getting something for the money that we're putting in to get a college education? We also experienced some sort of global pandemic a few years back, if you recall that, where a lot of students pivoted and they were working from home or sometimes from their parents' basement, anecdotally, but they were paying the same tuition. So people really started to ask, if I'm paying the same tuition, am I actually getting a good bang for my educational buck? What am I getting out of this? They're demanding more from it. And last but not least, taxpayers dedicate a lot of money and they demand a return on their investment too through anything and everything. In fact, they dedicate about $110 billion of taxpayer subsidies just through student grants and loans each and every single year. So it's important that we have plentiful resources because higher education is critical nowadays. We need it to remain globally competitive, but we also want to ensure that it's doing what we think and that it's paying off for our country and students specifically. Now, as I started thinking about how can we do this, at first I was thinking way back when to some economics class, and I thought, there's a price to earnings premium that stock analysts look at to determine the value of stocks. They have a pretty good idea of how much it costs. They have a pretty good idea of how much they might earn, and they have a pretty good idea of its value upon purchasing. And I thought about this dark, black hole when it comes to college before a few years back, and I thought students and consumers and families should have a similar idea in terms of what they're paying and what kind of economic return that they will get after they attend a specific institution or graduate from a specific college program. So I introduced something a few years back called the price to earnings premium that did just that. It looked at the out-of-pocket costs that students were paying, the net cost for anyone familiar with that jargon or terminology. So this is the cost after all grants and scholarships are deducted. What are you actually paying out of pocket, whether that be through personal finances or student loans, relative to the earnings premium, right? And essentially with these two things, I took it and I looked at it and I thought, wow, you can measure the time it takes students to actually recoup these educational costs based off of the earnings premium that they obtain. So just looking at the metrics and what this actually means, definitionally, the out-of-pocket costs are the net costs, right? After all grants and scholarships are deducted. And I made some assumptions, right? There are some ways to do this, and these are the assumptions that I made, and they're definitely up for discussion. But I decided to be generous the first time around and assume that it takes 4 years to complete a bachelor's degree, 2 years to complete an associate's degree, and 1 year to complete a certificate program. Now, we probably know, a lot of us probably know National Student Clearinghouse suggests it takes a little bit longer. It takes about 5.1 years to complete a bachelor's degree, 3.3 years to complete an associate's degree. But for this specific kind of study, I decided to make the assumption that if students finish on time, how much are they paying out of pocket? And the way that I define earnings premium is kind of intuitive. Are students earning more than a high school graduate with no college experience that never went to college, right? You're counterfactual within the state that that institution is located. So if you're earning more than someone with no college experience, that's additional money that you've obtained by going to an institution or graduating from a specific college program. So that's the way, and looking at these two things together will help us see how long it takes students to recoup their educational costs. So just looking at how this kind of plays out in general, here's just an example, a broad example of 3 institutions. One, California State Dominguez Hills. You can see the net cost to get a 4-year degree, rather affordable nowadays, about $13,000 over 4 years in out-of-pocket costs to obtain a bachelor's degree. Now, these students are still, they are earning about $20,000 more than the typical high school and graduate in California with no college experience whatsoever. So that's additional money that they're getting after they attend this institution. Therefore, they can use that around $20,000 to recoup those $13,000 or so dollars in just a little more than half a year. Now, if we look at Liberty, it costs a lot more, right? It costs over $100,000 over a 4-year period to get a bachelor's degree. Now, the majority of students, or the typical student, is earning about $11,700 more than the typical high school graduate in Virginia. Therefore, they can use that $11,700 additional dollars to recoup that $100,000 in 8.7 years. Now, at the bottom of our list, not the bottom of this whole list, but the bottom of this list is Martin University in Indiana. It costs about $70,000 to obtain a bachelor's degree over 4 years, but the typical student earns $300 less than the typical high school graduate in Indiana, even 10 years after they've enrolled in Martin University. Therefore, in this study, I determined that institution to have no economic ROI whatsoever, as these students have paid the price to attend this institution. They may have, they've worked towards their credential, but they're still earning less than someone with no college experience whatsoever. Now, this is just how it plays out across the whole country if you're wanting to look at large-term trends. And I would say there's promising news here, right? You always see the question. It might even be the title of this webinar. Forgive me, James, but is college worth it? And the answer is yeah, it still is. It should be celebrated. The majority of the time, we can see that colleges are allowing students to earn enough to recoup their educational costs within 5 years or less, almost 2/3 of them, right? So I understand the narrative and the declining confidence, but we can see the majority of the time, if you're in it for a return on your educational investment, the answer is a resounding yes, the heavy majority of the time. Now, that being said, we kind of want this for each and every institution that is federally funded, right? It's something that we assume happens. At least maybe I did, and most of the people I talked to assumed yes. The majority of students should earn more than someone with no college experience, but at 14% of institutions, or 442 within this national study, the majority of students are still earning less than the typical high school graduate, and that's even 10 years, like I said, after they have initially enrolled.
Michael, can I jump in here quickly?
Absolutely.
Does this take into account all students who enroll, or is it all students who complete?
When I look at institutions through the data, it's all students who enroll. So some of them may have completed, some of them have not completed. And the argument here is that if you attended any college, the majority of students, right, it's the typical student, so the median student should still have or be able to earn more than the typical high school graduate. But that's a great question.
And there's another good one in the chat. Christine, you want to come off mute and ask quickly?
I'm just kind of have the curiosity of if you take this and you actually segmented it by like student background, socioeconomic status, racial demographics, I'm assuming it's weighted towards the more privileged students that are the one on the left-hand side of the chart versus the right, or I'd be curious if you've seen any outliers.
you must have been planted, because that leads us to one of our next slides.
Do my best.
And I really appreciate that. There are certain ways that we can slice and dice the data, right? And there's no racial and ethnic information nationally in terms of how students from different demographics, they'll pay a different amount and they'll earn a different amount. But one of the things that we can do is by income, right? We can look at family income. And these students who have a family income in this example of $30,000 or less, they're going to pay a different amount and they're going to earn a different amount, right? So we can look at Cal State Dominguez, and are those students getting a good ROI, right? And we can see that these students are actually paying a lot less. Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was someone asking a question. They're actually paying a lot less than the typical student at Cal State Dominguez. They're still earning about $15,000 more. They're able to recoup their costs really quickly. At Liberty, we can see something a little different. These students are actually paying more than the typical student. They're earning less than the typical student, and they're actually taking longer because of that. And at Martin, these are lower income students who have attended Martin University. They're actually left earning $4,000 a year less than the typical high school graduate. And I can argue, we may actually sometimes be perpetuating socioeconomic inequality when lower income students attend college, they pay, they go there, and they're ultimately left earning less, rather than encouraging economic mobility, which I think is something that we all want to do.
Can I ask another question? Or should we wait till the end? Okay, on the other slide, I'm also wondering the impact of financial aid. And so while they may be making, these earnings beyond high school, if they, depending upon how much they're paying or having to pay towards their financial aid, where does that leave them?
Now, these are the actual out-of-pocket costs. Okay, so I hope I can answer your question correctly. So they're going to have to pay these costs, right? Financial aid is a big factor. Like you look at California, for example, they typically have more affordable higher education options because of the Cal Grant and additional financial aid that's going towards students. So you'll see them paying less, but they're still responsible. Like the left-hand column is what they're responsible for on average in terms of out-of-pocket costs for this specific student demographic. So they're either going to pay that out of pocket, right? They have the money or they're working for it, or that can be through federal grants and loans. So they're paying it somehow. And it has to be through one of those two means that they're typically responsible for paying out of pocket.
Okay, so that net cost is not just their expected family contribution, which they have to make while in school. It could be what they're paying back in loans.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So as you all probably know, like that was the institution level study. And you asked the question, are these students that these are just students that attended the institution, right? Some of them may have graduated, some of them may have not. When we look, but there's more nuanced ways to look at this, and program level stuff kind of matters, right? Sometimes what you study can matter actually more in terms of value in comparison to the institution that you attend. Now, when we're looking at programmatic level data, it does look at a different kind of student and only looks at graduates, right? So these are students that have done everything right. They paid their tuition, they've completed their classes, they've gotten their credential, and they've entered the workforce. So these are students that have done everything right. It's a different question that we're able to answer through program level data. And we can see some wildly different outcomes depending on what you study at specific institutions across the United States. So here's just an example of a recent study I did with College Futures Foundation, and we started to look at institutions and college programs in California, right? And what we saw is that at University of Southern California, depending on what you study can make a big difference in terms of how long it takes you to recoup your educational costs. Now, on average, students pay about $117,000 out of pocket to get a four-year degree at USC. But if you study economics, these students are doing pretty well. They're earning $72,000, $73,000 more than the typical high school graduate. So they're able to use those additional $73,000 to recoup that $117,000 in just 1.6 years. If you studied sociology like I did, which I'm a big advocate for doing, you would just make less. You would pay a similar amount, but you would make less than an economics major, and it would take you a little bit longer. Therefore, it would take you about 2.9 years to recoup your educational costs. But if you decided to study music, what we can see from former students, this is 5 years after they've graduated with a music major from USC, these students are actually earning $1,300 less than the typical high school graduate in California, even though they paid about $118,000 to get their music degree. Now, there may be other benefits to getting any kind of degree, but in terms of pure economics, we consider this to have no economic ROI because they are still earning less than the typical high school graduate.
I'm sorry, I just had a quick question. So, and if you already answered this, so the total net cost is the out-of-pocket cost. So for sociology, is that correct?
Yes.
So this person X had $117,000 that they paid out of pocket, and they have a yearly earning of 41,000. They paid off that 117 in
They have
9
a, let me just clarify. They have a yearly earning of $41,000 beyond the typical high school graduate. So in California, we can see that the typical high school graduate makes around $27,000 per year in between 25 and 34 years old. These students, these graduates make $42,000, $41,000 beyond that. Does that make sense?
person, yeah, it makes sense. So this person, if that's the baseline they make around the 20s, so this person's making like 60 to like 80, and they're
Yeah,
able to pay it off in 2.9 years.
correct. You got it. Right. So we have this program level data available for pretty much all programs or a heavy majority of programs across the United States. I see that someone asked, what's the data source? It is the US Department of Education's college scorecard data. They get this data, which is through financial aid recipients through the Department of Education. So it's real student data, right? Like that's the advantage of this data. And they actually match it with tax records. So it's an actual data, administrative data source, which is kind of considered to be the gold mine of data in comparison to stuff like surveys, where students kind of answer sometimes if they're really happy about their outcomes, or sometimes if they're really dissatisfied. So again, this is just an example of work that I've been doing in states and with different organizations. In this specific example, with College Futures in California, there are about 2,700 college programs in California that we can look at. And again, good news for college, all right? Is college worth it? Resoundingly in California, the answer is yes. About 88% of college programs in California allow graduates to recoup their educational costs in 5 years or less. At a third of those programs, students are able to recoup those costs in 1 year or less. But worrisome, very worrisome. Graduates, people who have done everything right, there are still 112 college programs where the majority of completers, of graduates, are earning less than the typical high school graduate. So just for your reference, there's different ways to look at this, right? And we wanted to see, are there differences in the type of degree you get, whether you get a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree in California or a certificate degree. And we've done this in the state. We can do it in other states or nationally, but this is just specific to California. And what we saw in California is that it was actually associate's degrees where students were able to recoup their costs the quickest. This education for two-year publics especially is extremely affordable. It provides high enough of an earnings premium, and therefore these students are able to recoup these costs really quickly. In fact, about 2/3 of associate college programs allow their graduates, their completers, to recoup those costs in just 1 year or less. Bachelor's degrees, they cost more on average every single year. They also take longer, right? They take 4 years, but students are still earning a high enough premium to oftentimes, about 92% of the time, recoup those costs in 5 years or less. Still longer than an associate's degree. And certificate programs, I'll just say, when they work well, they can be one of the fastest paths to socioeconomic mobility. Students are usually in those programs for a year. They gain a specific skill set, enter the workforce, and start earning immediately. When they work well, they can be one of the fastest paths to getting ahead economically. And that happens about a third of the time here. But we can also see that they are sometimes the riskiest kinds of programs, as about a quarter leave the majority of their graduates earning less than the typical high school graduate, even 5 years after they've completed the program. We also looked at the educational sector that is delivering the program. Does it make a difference whether you're public, private, nonprofit, or a for-profit institution, and whether these students graduate from your program? And what we saw is that about 97% of public programs in California showed the majority of graduates able to recoup their costs in 5 years or less. Almost half of these programs show their graduates able to recoup their costs in 1 year or less. Private nonprofits are typically 4-year institutions in California. They cost more in general than public institutions. They usually take longer. They're usually 4 years. Now, therefore, we don't see a large percentage where students are recouping their costs really quickly, less than 10% in 1 year, but we do see a lot of them where students are recouping these costs within a 5-year time frame. And at for-profit institutions, what we can see is that there are some that allow their graduates to recoup their costs quickly, but we do see these being disproportionately risky in comparison to public programs or private nonprofit programs, as about a fifth of them leave the majority of their graduates with no economic ROI in California whatsoever. Now, I'm just going to show you this, and I hope you can check out the report if you would like to dig a little deeper. But we also looked at the most popular programs, whether that be bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, or certificates, right? These are the things that students major in most often at the different levels of education. And we wanted to see what kind of outcomes those types of programs have, as they're really different sometimes. So here where we can see the most popular programs, whether it be allied health, vehicle maintenance, practical nursing, or dental support services. Now, if you major in vehicle maintenance or practical nursing, if you get a certificate, you're able to recoup those costs quickly, right? Like it's almost a shoo-in, as almost, the majority of these programs show their students recouping their costs in 1 year or less, right? That's pretty impressive for these types of programs. Other types of programs like dental support services, about a quarter of them actually leave the majority of the graduates with no economic ROI whatsoever. So if you wanted to look at this in your state, this is just another way to slice and dice the data if you wanted to just look at all of similar types of programs, no matter who's offering them at different credential levels.
Some of my most fun conversations in my work is supporting counselors and giving them the data to talk their cosmetology bound students out of cosmetology.
I didn't mention that specifically, but yes, you can see the outcomes when it comes to that program that people pay for out of pocket and sometimes and oftentimes take out financial aid for as well. So why do economic mobility? What does that even mean? Well, I showed you that chart before where I looked at the outcomes for low income students whose family background is between $0 and $30,000 per year total. So I decided to run that nationally, and I was really excited about this project when I did it a few years back. These students pay a different amount, they earn a different amount. What institutions are best for low income students? What provides them with the best ROI? So I put this in the spreadsheet, I pressed enter, all the numbers came out. And who did I see at the top of the list? I don't know if it was who I was expecting, but it was schools like Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I thought, congratulations, Mike, you just recreated the US News rankings. You can go home now, you've done a great job. Pat yourself on the back. But then I did see another number on the right-hand side of the column, and that was the percentage of Pell Grant students or low and moderate income students that these institutions enroll. And as you can see, almost all of them are below 20%. The next slide. And that kind of brought me to my question, like, what's the purpose of higher education in general? Is it really to recognize and reward the few and the fortunate? Right? That's what we've been doing forever through these popular news publications. Or is it to recognize schools that are actually bringing in a generation of students, lifting them up, and leaving them better off than the previous generation? So that's when I started to think about how can I assess economic mobility in general. So I started to look at two factors. I did look at the ROI for low-income students. If you're serving low-income students and serving them well, you should be recognized for doing that. But I also wanted to look at, that's just not enough, because some of these schools, as you saw, they serve low-income students really well, but they hardly serve any of them. So I decided to look at these two numbers together, the ROI for low-income students meshed with the proportion of low and moderate income students that an institution enrolls, and I threw those together and created something called the Economic Mobility Index. As some of you may be familiar, there was an economist at Harvard named Raj Chetty who started doing this a long time ago. And he started to look at intergenerational mobility. Are students better than their parents? And this really builds upon that work. And a number of other research organizations have continued to build upon this work that was introduced a few years back. So this is just the way this generally plays out. But if you're a school like Stanford, Harvard, or Yale or Princeton that has an amazing ROI for your low-income students, right? They're generous aid packages for these students are going to do very well economically. You're at the top of the top in terms of the ROI. And I'm going to reward you for that within this metric. You are still, I'm going to give you 100%. You're near the top of the list. So I do a percentile rank. And if you have an amazing ROI, you're near the top of the list. You're about the 100th percentile in terms of all four-year institutions. If you're somewhere in the middle of terms of ROI for low-income students, you get 50%. If you're near the bottom, you are assigned 0% in a rank order. Then I took that rank order of institutions, which is the ROI for low-income students, and I multiplied it by the percentage of Pell Grant students. And that's how we look at, are these institutions serving low-income students generally and serving them well? And what do we see? What happens when we mesh those two numbers together? Well, schools like Harvard, who were ranked number 4 in terms of ROI for their low and moderate income students, when you combine that with the percentage of Pell Grant students that they actually serve, they drop from number 4 to number 847. When you look at schools like University of Chicago, that were ranked number 8 in terms of ROI for their low income students, when you combine that with the low Pell Grant students that they serve, they drop from number 8 to 860. Right? But who jumps to the top of the list? On the top 10 that I saw, it was actually all Hispanic serving institutions, just in the top 10. They were located in New York, California, and Texas. And they were the top of the top in terms of institutions that were serving a broad group of students and serving them extremely well. I also saw a number of schools who aren't typically mentioned anywhere on popular news publications like US News, like HBCUs. There were 7 in the top 100 that are recognized through things like the Economic Mobility Index. These schools have been serving a diverse and broad group of students from different backgrounds and means for a very long time and serving them extremely well. And this is a way that we recognize their contribution in terms of serving a broad group of students, lifting them up and leaving them better off than the previous generation.
Michael, I'm sorry. Is it just me? My slides are not advancing. I'm still on the U.S. News and Economic Mobility.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, I'm just.
Oh, I thought you were showing us the universities that were in fact coming to the top of the list.
No,
I'm sorry, I didn't see them.
You're good. You're good. I did leave that one out, Julie. So what is next? These are just some thoughts that I have. Maybe they're good, maybe they're really not, but we have more data on student outcomes than we've ever had before. I've showed you national studies. We've done that, right? Those are good for federal policy. I showed you some state stuff, right? And I think that that's really important. I've worked with some organizations in some states, and there's so much work to be done, right? So there's really critical stuff that we can do at the state level to identify institutions, college programs at institutions, and certain types of college programs that are serving their graduates really, really well. Another thing that I've been saying for a long time, but I think is important, is there's all different ways to interpret data, but it is actionable, right? Students need this information in front of them. They need to understand the costs. They need to understand the potential outcomes, and they deserve that in terms of considering a broader group of institutions or programs or narrowing it down from considering a broad group and thinking what may or may not work for them. This can absolutely be used by policymakers at the federal or state level. And I would encourage college accreditors to also, before providing their stamp of approval, ensuring better outcomes by using this data as a first step by looking at it and ensuring that students are getting good outcomes. And I would say what we've seen as a next step that some organizations are starting to do, which I think is critical, is that we're looking at projected jobs in the future, right? Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce came out with a report that suggests that 71% of all jobs by 2031 will require some sort of post-secondary training, whether that be a certificate, an associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree. But it's critical that we're sort of matching the skill sets that students are focusing on to be able to fill those jobs, right? So we have the information, and some institutions and states and or federal policy thinkers are thinking about how do we match those programs to make sure that students are well equipped to enter the next phase of the 21st century. So with that, I think we'll be opening up for questions, or I'll hand it over to James. But I appreciate you all sticking with me, and I hope it wasn't too boring.
Definitely not too boring, very meaningful. I see Willow's work, and one of my superpowers is connecting good data and policy down to the practice level. And I know there's a lot of practitioners on the call. So my takeaways are we have to stop normalizing sending students to institutions where more students fail than complete and succeed. And so focusing on completion rates really matters. And in Colorado, that's tough. There's not a lot of institutions that meet that bar. Secondly, Michael pointed out that program matters almost more than the provider in a lot of cases. And so we have to use a tool and get this information in front of students and their families to help them. That's obvious. Like one obvious tool I'm thinking about is Willow. College Scorecard, you can also look at the fields of study and kind of backwards map where are the stronger programs there. And then finally, and this is to Michael's point too, I think we're building a movement around this work. I call it, love it or hate it, the student loan forgiveness program from the Biden administration was a $1 trillion advertisement that the ROI of higher ed has not been working often enough for what we need, especially for students who have received Pell Grants. And value-based counseling, ROI-based counseling, I think is a really important part of the future. So with that, we are going to open it up to questions. And both Michael and I, you can please follow up with us directly if we want to go deeper. Lots of questions in the chat, so let's whoever can unmute first gets to go.
I have a question. Sorry, I know I asked before. Okay, I have it's two. First question is, where can we get the data? If you guys already scrape data for all colleges across the United States, I'm looking. I would love that, so I could provide it to my college counselors on the ROI for individual colleges and where students have the less amount of the fastest being able to fastest pay off their college tuition. So that's question number one.
Yep.
Question number two is for career pathways. Where can we get, what data sources do you recommend that we look at to determine if barbering is a good return on investment and how long it would take for that student to pay it off? That's one thing that you didn't discuss. You mentioned like how long it takes to pay off for cosmetology, but you did not mention how you got that data. And if you can't mention it, tell us how we could do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're giving me more things to work on, so I appreciate that. But what I will say to your first question is something that we do pride ourselves on at the HEA group is I try to do a public service by scraping the data, cleaning it up, and making it readily downloadable, accessible for everyone. I think that it's not doing any good sitting on my hard drive. So I provide that on the website and you can download it for free. It's I want everyone to have it as I think it serves a public good. So that's step one. This does come from the U.S. Department of Education College Scorecard if you wanted to go that route, but we cleaned it up for you. In terms of the other question, I think it's critical and really interesting. And like I said, this was sort of a first stab that we did that information on specific types of college programs in California. There's a number of ways to slice and dice that data. I chose to focus on the most popular programs for that state. Those are the outcomes that you have, that you've seen in front of you. I haven't done that for other states yet, and I haven't done that nationally. So that is something that we could potentially work on in the future, and we'll definitely take into consideration.
But we can't do that on our own.
I mean, it's a difficult process. You can definitely do that on your own. So it involves, data scraping and cleaning and coding, and it's really the U.S. Department of Education College Scorecard.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mike, I'd be happy to follow up with you directly too. That is what we're building for K-12 schools and counselors at Willow, is to take the best available data and information and put it in front of students and counselors in a student-friendly way.
It is pretty critical. So that's why we moved forward with that part of the report. as I think it's a sort of eye opener for folks who are thinking about different college majors before they ultimately enter.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed this presentation, and there's been this interesting tension throughout like our conversation on whether it's most effective to focus on the supply side, like institutional, like propelling for economic mobility versus the demand. And I'm just wondering like your thoughts on what's the most effective. It's probably a both and situation, but like what are the case studies of like the best supply side solutions and the best demand side solutions?
Now, can you just say it, like, explain that a little more so I can give you a more a better, robust answer?
Yeah. So it's basically like are we trying to change the way institutions do business, like this kind of the supply side of it, or is it like changing the thinking of students as they're making these decisions, more the demand side?
Well, I think
Does
it's
that make sense?
both and, so I would say that the way that institutions have generally been funded is by enrollment, right? It's a revenue stream. You're going to get revenue coming in through how many students enroll in your institution. It's not typically based off of any sort of outcomes. But what we've tried to do is to make these outcomes readily available so that they're in front of everyone's faces, right? Like the data's there, we see it. So how are institutions going to react to that? Ultimately, I think it's beneficial for their long-term strategic planning to look at these outcomes, to think about their geography, what kind of jobs are opening up, and to think about how they can match that demand, that employer demand, with the supply of credential holders that they're ultimately graduating, right? One of the things that I see with this no ROI, economic ROI bucket, there's a number of reasons why a certain college program can land there. And it's a dig deeper thing if you're a college administrator. It could be, is it the department or the professors? Are they a horrible associate, a adjunct professor like I was, and I'm just not any good? That could be it. Are we not giving students the correct skill set, right? Are we not equipping them with the skills to succeed in the economy? Is it our career resource center? We're not actively matching students with employers that have these job openings, or are we providing credentials to where there's no jobs within the geographic region that we're offering them? It's usually the latter, right? We're giving these credentials. There's no jobs in the area, but we keep pushing them out, even though we're not seeing any sort of economic outcomes. So I think it is critical that administrators begin to look at this data as a long-term strategic play to raise the outcomes for all of their students, but also, as a public good, to make sure that students are getting a good ROI, no matter what they study.
Michael, thanks so much for the presentation. Just in line with that thinking, when you present this data on economic mobility outcomes or ROI, generally speaking, like what's the reaction from college presidents, administrators? Generally speaking, what's their reaction been? And if you found any that have really embraced it, can you either name them specifically or as a whole, what types of institutions are they working at?
Well, people have been very critical, colleges, of U.S. News rankings as the most popular news publication for a really long time, right? So it underrepresents schools that are serving different student demographics and doing it really well. So when I first introduced this a number of years back, it got an amazing response because there's only a very 1% of students go to Ivy League colleges, less than 1%. If you're one of the other 99% of students, this is the metric for you, right? It shows how well institutions are actually serving a broad group of students. So I've seen institutions that are putting this on their website, that are marketing their institution, that are saying that they're a top tier program on the Economic Mobility Index, or number 62 at Florida International University down here in Florida, or wherever it may be. These institutions that you don't normally think of, but they do a really good job of serving their community. Oftentimes, regional public universities, things like that. Cal State is another one that jumps to the list just off the top of my mind. These affordable institutions that serve a broad group of students and do it really well. They're punching above their weight, and now they have a way to recognize themselves. The one other thing I'll mention is that I went to a group called Excelencia, and they give a seal of excellence every year to Hispanic serving institutions. And when I saw this, the top 10, as I mentioned, were Hispanic serving institutions. So I went to their executive director and I said, Deb, look, the top 10 are HSIs. And she said, well, duh, like we give them the seal of excellence every single year. But now we have the data to back it up. So, you know, it's another way to recognize schools by using data, and it's critical for them. So I would say it's been very well received. Harvard has not gotten back to me on their number 847 ranking. And I'm sure that they're not going to, and they have other rankings that they will happily talk about with you.
Curious, so if we go to your site, I'm curious about, do you have a small number of states that you have this data on? Because I have particular interest in particular states, so Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and I'm wondering if you have those, and then obviously I want to look at the colleges as well, but I'd start at the state level.
We have all different kinds of data. So I looked at access, affordability, and outcomes. So it depends on the publication and the data set. That kind of study that I just presented was specifically towards California. There are some other folks who are interested in doing state level analysis. So, that's something that we've been in talks with other folks about, and I would love to expand for us to be able to do that for different states. So if you have any ideas, or if there's other ways I can be helpful, just let me know, as it's something that, the HEA group would love to work on and continue to work on.
Well, what you just presented for the states that I listed would be ideal, but you're saying that California was the first stop. This is the first.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was the first
Okay.
step.
Okay.
Christine or Julie, you want to ask your thriving wage question?
I don't know if Christine is still here, so there you are, Christine.
Yeah, sorry, it took me a second to come off mute. Yeah, I mean, I love the data, and I think it's really intuitive. I'm curious if you've done a cut, and we can have the data by different regions or by different states, but by kind of living wage. And so there's can you pay back your cost of attendance, but also are these programs actually providing you a living wage within a certain time frame? So curious if you've done that cut, or if you know anybody who's done that cut of the data.
I think you're referring to the MIT living wage calculation. Is that correct? Or?
That's one that we use, but any view of is there a minimum income threshold for actually, if we think about a good program that you'll get you into a good career, a good job, versus might be a cheap program with a low starting wage that you can pay back, but is that going to kind of build?
So there's a number of different, to your point, right? There's a number of different ways. And is this the right threshold, right? What I use is typical high school graduate within the state. This is using data from the American Community Survey.
Yep.
High school graduates who are between 25 and 34. How much are they earning on average in comparison? I think what you're saying is, well, maybe that's not enough, right? Like they pay so much, and and there's living wages, there's healthcare, there's childcare, there's all these different things that go into a living wage. So I did do a study that looked at different thresholds, and one of them was the high school graduate. One of them was a federal poverty line, I think. One of them, and believe it or not, there's some institutions where the majority of students earn less than that. There's a high school graduate wage. There was a $15 minimum wage as another example of something I looked at. So there are different ways to cut it. I think what you're asking about is there are metropolitan specific differences in regions, like in a state like California, that can be rather big. When I cut American Community Survey data, sometimes the sample size gets too small, right? So that's one of the limitations that I've encountered from doing that. The sample size becomes unreliable and it's too small. The other issue is that after a student graduates XYZ institution, I don't know where they're living afterwards, right? So I don't know if they graduated from this region, if they're still living in that region, or if they live in a completely different region. So there would be a lot of assumptions that would need to be made, but that's a very smart and oftentimes asked question that as a data nerd, I would love to have more answers to.
Yeah, or even like and sorry, you hear some kids in the background here. Even
If
if
they're going to be
it,
there, bring them on camera at least.
I know, well, we've got lots of kids home from school today. Um, or even just having visibility, like given that there's different kind of ranges and we don't know where they're living, having visibility even of like tranches of wages could be really interesting to say, you know, we all intuitively know that a wage under $40,000 is going to be tough in most MSAs or localities or whatnot. So anyway, just yeah, curiosity as we're thinking about different ROI and pathways.
It definitely is, you know, like
Yeah.
it's intuitive, like you said, and that's why this has resonated with folks. It's just like, am I earning more than someone with this thing, you know, a high school diploma with no college experience? Like it makes intuitive sense. The other things can become a little bit, it leaves a lot of room for discussion, which may be the right discussion to have. But that's sort of one of the advantages that I've seen by taking this a simpler in comparison to something with a little bit more complexity. What's his question?
Snack.
Hi, quick question. Where can we get the list of the social mobility index schools? You mentioned that, you mentioned where the Ivy stood in terms of like ranking 800. But even if it's a truncated list of like top 50.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I introduced this a number of years back when I was working as a senior fellow for Third Way. They've continued to build on this. So they use the same methodology and have continued to build on it and release an updated list as of 2024. As I said, I'm not involved with that specific list, but I know that that's been worked on. You can also go to the HEA Group website to where you have this publication and it'll link to that and you can find out all the information there.
I can include that in a follow-up to all the attendees.
Thank you, James.
Yeah. Okay, last question from Justin. You want to come off mute, Justin? Are you able to?
Yeah, sorry, I had to stay off camera. I appreciate the presentation. I think it's really good data. I've been following a good bit of your work for over the last few years, so I really do appreciate it. I did just want to quickly ask a question that might be somewhat already answered or through implication, but does this research kind of account for those public good jobs like social work or something that tend to have lower wages, but could potentially, benefit from public service loan forgiveness or something like that? I'm just curious about how the results would play out for a school that produces a higher percentage of those types of graduates. Because it seems on its face it would look a little bit more negative for them. I just don't know if that's already accounted for. So
thanks for the question. And I don't know if it's the right way to say it looks more negative, right? But what I would say is it would look like it takes longer for social workers to recoup their educational costs than computer science majors at the same institution, right? So it's a purely economic perspective to your point. We need social workers, right? And there are schools that only focus on social work and do a tremendous job. Now, their students are going to earn less than computer science majors. So I would say that's something that people need to know ahead of time. And regardless of if you're an art major or a music major or a sociology major or a social work major or a computer science major, you should be able to earn more at least than the typical high school graduate in your state. So that's a minimum economic threshold. When you go beyond that, yes, there are going to be differences. And we're going to see, generally that social workers, it takes them longer to recoup these educational costs because they're just simply not rewarded economically as much within the labor force today.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Michael for his excellent work and sharing that and helping build a movement for return on investment for higher education around the country to make sure that the promise of higher ed pays off for every student that accesses higher ed. So just really appreciate your work. It's certainly influenced my work a lot, and it's fun to spend more time with you.